Good morning. Go ahead and grab your Bible. And you can join me in Mark chapter 14. And if you don't have a Bible, we'd love for you to use that one there in the pew if you'd like to hold one in your hands. And you can find Mark chapter 14 on page 902 in that Bible there in the pew. And as you're turning there, we are going to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning. And so if you didn't get a cup when you came in this morning, we want to give you the opportunity to get one now. And if you're a member of this church, we'd invite you to participate. If you're not a member of this church, you just happen to be visiting with us today, but you are a believer, you've placed your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you're in good standing with your church, we would also invite you to participate as well. And so if you didn't get one of these, would you just raise your hands? We have deacons all across the room. They're standing up now, and right over here. Sometimes you walk in and either they're all gone or you just didn't see it. And so we want to make sure you get one of these. So leave your hand up and they'll eventually make their way to you. And we'll do that at the end of the time together. Don't open it up yet, okay? A few weeks ago, I think we had a few of you guys open it up at the beginning of the service, and you had to sit there and hold it, like nurse it for the remainder of the message. We'll do that at the end. And man, I've just been in awe of some of these truths that we have sung this morning. Just the reality of the hope that we have in Christ. And whether you were familiar with the tunes or not, or necessarily like the particular song, man, you can't but help just be overwhelmed with the reality of some of those truths, those things that God has accomplished for us through his Son, Jesus Christ, and the fact that we've come from death to life. I mean, there's a freedom that we have that we walk in each day that many of us don't even realize. We don't take into account. We live in the change of this world, and we forget the freedom that we've been given in Christ. And so as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, it's just going to be another opportunity for us to be reminded of that truth. And even as we think about this week, as we approach Easter, I want to encourage you on Wednesday night, all across this building, there's opportunities for our kids and students and our college students. And this week for our adults, midweek will be a little bit unique. We're still going to have it in the Generations Hall, but we're going to have a special service focused on Psalm 22, kind of a Holy Week service. And so anybody's welcome to join us at 6 p.m. and there will last about 45 minutes. So we would love for you to be a part of that if you're not typically there. It's just another way for you to embrace this week and the opportunity we have to celebrate the death and then soon to be the resurrection of Christ. And then, of course, next Sunday is Easter Sunday. And I hope you've been praying for our church as we gather next Sunday. I hope you've been thinking about someone you can invite to come with you or meet you in the Commons, either for worship or for your community group. Just a reminder, we will have our service 10:30 next week as usual. There's also a 7 a.m. service, not in here, but in Generations Hall. And we initially started doing this for those who were going to be working in our preschool worship care. We wanted them to have the opportunity to gather for worship. And but if you would just like to come at 7 a.m., I mean, if you're up anyway and you just want to come in and do it twice or let that be your time, you're welcome to do that. If you want to come and be a part of that service, and we're going to have a little bit of a breakfast following that. And then you can even prayer walk the building for us. If you've got a place to serve, you can go ahead and get an early start on serving there. There will not be childcare for the 7 a.m., okay? That would be a kick in the pants for someone, right? You're getting up and watching someone else's kids at 7 a.m., so we didn't do that. So if you come with young kids, which I'm assuming most people with young kids are probably going to come later, but if you do come with young kids at the 7 a.m., then that's on you. And but you're still welcome to participate. Well, we have been working through a series called Outside the Garden. And the whole premise here is that there in Genesis chapter 3, where we began several weeks ago, that Adam and Eve were driven from the garden. Initially, they were there, they were walking with God, They were experiencing God in a relationship intimately, face to face, and then they were separated from God. They were driven outside the garden. And what we've been saying is this, is that our primary problem in life, the primary problem for humanity, is that we have been separated from God. That's the picture of death in the Bible. Physical death is separation, your soul, your spirit separated from your body. Spiritual death is when your spirit is separated from the source of life, God himself. And throughout history, we have seen people try to deal with this problem, try to create their own utopias with their life, and we're guilty of that. I mean, even here in the South, right, we can live our lives and try to make everything just right. We can work out and take care of our health, and those are all good things, but not in a sense that we're trying to work against the curse. The reality is none of us are strong enough to beat death, right? These old bodies are going to break down eventually, no matter how hard we try, and so our hope ultimately is not in what we can do. Same thing with security. We try to make our lives as secure as possible. We spend a lot of money on comfort, on all kinds of things, right? Trying to protect ourselves from suffering. But the truth is, we will all suffer. There are moments where it becomes very clear that we live outside of the garden. And if we're not careful, we can try to recreate the garden without God, the God of the garden. We can try to recreate our own utopia, life to the fullest, apart from God, and we cannot do that. The key to being made right, and everything being restored and made right in this world is not in us trying and doing harder and better. No, it's in what God has done through his son, Jesus Christ. And even last week, we saw people dealing with the fall. What was man trying to do? Pastor Joey talked about it. He was trying to build a tower to the heavens, right? He was trying to make something of himself, really trying to reach God. But we're going to see this morning that the key to restoration is not in us trying to reach God, but it's in the fact that God has come down. He has stooped down for us through the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the one who is the fulfillment of the promise that was given to Adam and Eve. Remember in the garden when they experienced the judgment of God. As God is speaking to the serpent, he says that the serpent, you will strike the heel, right, the seed of the woman, but the seed of the woman will eventually crush the head of the serpent, will crush you. And Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise that one day, right, he's going to come, God incarnate here on the earth, and he's going to be tempted by the evil one, even persecuted by the evil one, but ultimately he will triumph and restore what's been lost. And we see this happening even here in Mark chapter 14. It's just a few hours before Jesus is going to be tortured and crucified. And it's interesting where we find Jesus. We find Jesus entering another garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane was located on a hillside there, the Mount of Olives, and it was a place that Jesus often went. It was filled with olive trees, and the name Gethsemane itself means olive press. And here we're going to see Jesus, right, pressed in a way that he's never been pressed before. And so let's read these words together. Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 32. Then they, Jesus and his disciples, came to a place named Gethsemane, and he told his disciples, sit here for a while and pray. And then he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake. And then he went a little farther, fell to the ground, and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. And then he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Couldn't you stay awake 1 hour? Stay awake and pray so that you won't enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So once again, he went away and prayed, saying the same thing. And again he came and found them sleeping because they could not keep their eyes open. They did not know what to say to him. Then he came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The time has come. See, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. See, my betrayer is near." This is Palm Sunday, and it's a good thing to celebrate Palm Sunday. We also, this time of year soon, will focus on the cross of Jesus. Many churches will have Good Friday services, and then, of course, Sunday is we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, and certainly rightly so. But I think we often fail to see the significance of what Jesus is doing here in the garden. In fact, I had some seminary professors tell me years and years ago that here in the Garden of Gethsemane, eternity hangs in the balance. That here in the garden, we see Jesus overwhelmed. We see Jesus facing the cross. And as we think about this moment in Jesus' life, I'd like to break this text and cause us to think about three things in the relation to Jesus and God, right? We believe that Jesus is God himself in the flesh, fully God, fully human. And three things, the way Jesus deals with what's happening here in the garden, three things we can learn about God or know about God, even when we suffer, because suffering is a reality for all of us. In life, you will suffer. We live outside the garden. We live separated from God. Now, even for those of us who are Christians, right, we've been made alive with God. We know that Christ lives inside of us. We still live in a way distanced from God in a world that's fallen and broken. And to some degree or another, you will deal with suffering in life. You are dealing with suffering. Now, there's many kinds of suffering. Even Elle and I were talking about this last night. And, my life, I've not dealt with any huge physical issues or traumas or dealt with anybody. I've certainly walked with other people through those things, right? But myself, Ellen was like, you hadn't really dealt with much suffering, And I was like, oh, you're right, Ellen. But all of us to a certain degree, right, we've experienced some type of suffering. And so how do we deal with that here on this side, right, of being outside of the garden? Well, here, Jesus is going to help us. He's going to show this to us. And so three things I would point out here is, first of all, that we have a God who can relate to us in our suffering. We have a God who reveals how to be faithful in the midst of suffering. And we have a God who has undone our suffering. We have a God who relates, who knows what it's like to suffer. We have a God who can show us what it means to faithfully walk through suffering. And we have a God who has undone suffering. God knows. He can relate to us in our suffering. We don't know all that Jesus says here in the Garden of Gethsemane, but we do see the focus of what was weighing on his heart so heavily here. And we see it in verse 36. Looking at what he says in verse 36, he says, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not I will, but you will, your will." Here, Jesus makes this same plea three times. Twice we see it here. We see it three times in the Gospel of Matthew. But Jesus, over and over again, focuses on this cup. Now, what is this cup? What is this cup that Jesus is asking to be taken from him? It's obviously the source of much of his anguish here. And I believe the best answer to that question, there's all kinds of answers people have given over the years, but I think the best answer to that question is in looking at what lies directly ahead. That Jesus is about to be betrayed, he's about to be put on trial, turned over to Roman soldiers who were trained experts in torture and crucifixion. And so there's a certain aspect of the cross that is physical, yes, it's also psychological, right? They knew how to shame someone who was being crucified. And so I believe a certain aspect of the cup here that it's causing Jesus such anguish is the physical torment that he's about to face. Now, this would be enough, but I don't think it's just the physical death that Jesus is facing here that's causing him such sorrow. In fact, others have pointed out there have been martyrs in the past who have faced torture and death by various means, and they've been more stoic, right? They've been more defiant in their deaths. In fact, there was a man by the name of Polycarp who was a bishop of Smyrna back early in church history, and he was about to be burned. He wouldn't recant his faith. He was a Christian. He wasn't going to deny Christ, and so he was about to be burned, and this is what he said to those who were about to execute him. He said, "The fire you threaten burns but an hour and is quenched after a little. You now know that fire of the coming judgment. But why do you delay? Come, do what you will." So he was talking trash, right? He was about to be burned to death, and Polycarp was talking trash to the people, warning them that this fire that you're going to burn me with is only, right, temporary. But there's an eternal fire that's coming for you. And so why is Jesus in such anguish? Well, I would say it's because there's much more happening here. There's much more that he's facing than just a physical death on the cross. I believe the most terrifying aspect of this cup Jesus is facing in this cup is pointed to in the Old Testament in prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah. And those prophets spoke of the cup. Right? There's several places in the Bible that we can see this idea of the cup, but specifically in Jeremiah and Isaiah, they speak of the cup of God's fury. They speak of the cup of God's wrath. That this cup here is God's righteous response to sin in the world. This cup here is God's judgment being poured out upon those who deserve it. And Jesus is about to endure this cup. He's about to take God's wrath and punishment. Now, why would Jesus have to endure God's wrath? It's another good question. Right? Why would God punish Jesus? Because we know Jesus was without sin. Well, we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that Jesus was the one who knew no sin, but he was to be sin for us. And the prophet Isaiah says again in Isaiah 53 that there would be one who would come, this one named Jesus, who would carry our iniquities. He would bear the sin of the many, and he would intercede for the rebels. And then even John the Baptist says this, that here is the one, Jesus, who has come. He is the Lamb who has come to take away the sins of the world. And so why was the judgment of God about to be poured out in this cup upon the Son of God, Jesus? It wasn't because of his sin. It was because he was taking on our sin. He was about to become our sin on our behalf. And so Jesus will endure the wrath of God because he is taking the punishment for our sin, not just the physical death he's experiencing here, but there is very much a spiritual death. There is a spiritual separation that seems to be taking place here that Jesus is going to face on the cross. In fact, remember some of the words, the very words that Jesus says on the cross. In Mark chapter 15, verse 34, he says these words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What is Jesus doing there? Can the Father fully forsake the Son? Can he fully be separated from the Son? Well, I don't know. I mean, in one sense, we know that Jesus is identifying with the psalmist in Psalm 22. But in the same way, the psalmist there is experiencing abandonment. He's experiencing separation from God. And so we don't know all the details here, what's taking place in the Trinity, but we do know that on the cross, Jesus is experiencing alienation from his Father. Now, for us, that's hard for us to understand. Maybe the best way we can see it is a mom leaving her child in the nursery, right? That happens every Sunday. And if you remember the first time maybe you take your child into the nursery, they I think our child just kind of went for it. I think they loved it. Maybe it probably hurt our feelings a little bit because they just like, get me out of here, right? I want to come to you. But what can happen sometimes is that, right, the child is left there and it doesn't understand, doesn't have the ability to understand, just realizes he's being left with a stranger and his mom is abandoning him. And I'm sure that probably happens still every Sunday back there in the preschool wing. It's a very real reality for many of you. Right? Well, I think in the same way, but even to such an infinite degree, this is what Jesus is experiencing from the Father. Listen, the Son of God and God the Father have been in a relationship with the Spirit of God for eternity. There's no relationship like the Father has with the Son. And now the Son will experience the punishment of the Father. In his moment of punishment, he's going to experience alienation, in some way separation from the Father. And it's overwhelming to him. In fact, in verse 34, Jesus turns to Peter, James, and John, those who had come a little further, or who were walking a little further with him, and he says, I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Your translation may say, my soul is swallowed up with sorrow. Have you ever been there? Right, we know there's different degrees of suffering. My friends, there's no greater degree of suffering that anyone has ever faced than what we see Jesus dealing with here in the garden. But you've suffered, haven't you? There's been moments in your life when you've been overwhelmed. You've been in this dark place that Jesus finds himself in. Some have even compared Jesus here as having a panic attack. Right? His anxiety is too much. He falls to the ground. Typically the posture of prayer would be standing up. Here Jesus falls to his knees. In other Gospels it says it falls to his face. The reality of what is about to take place is sinking in here. The cross is not something we've known. Jesus knows he's going to go to Jerusalem and ultimately be delivered over to the hands of man, right? He's going to be executed, persecuted, and executed. But here, what Jesus saw out in the future is now there, right before him. He's so overwhelmed that Luke tells us in Luke 22, verse 24, that Jesus actually, his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. And we know medically you can sweat drops of blood. We don't know if that's what Jesus is doing or if this is more just he's saying like a metaphor, like blood falling, if that's how profusely he was sweating. But either way, we know, we get a sense of the depth of Jesus' despair here. Jesus was also let down and left alone here. So not only is he in great need and overwhelmed by his circumstances, but he's also been let down. I mean, what does he do? He goes back to his closest disciples, those three, and he finds them sleeping, resting. These are the three he took a little further, right? His closest friends, and they're falling asleep in his greatest moment of need. And once again, have you been there? Have you been to the place where you felt overwhelmed with despair, with depression, anxiety, and with what you're facing in life or just the circumstances? And sometimes it can be something that's happened in a relationship, or something that's happened physically to you, or just there's something else and it just feels overwhelming to you, and you just need to know someone else knows what you're going through. And that's what Jesus needs here. And yet those closest to him have let him down. And eventually we'll see they'll leave him alone. They abandon him. He's so left alone that it's interesting. As you read in Luke chapter 22, verse 43, there's actually an angel from heaven. Jesus is in such bad shape here. There's an angel from heaven that appears to him, strengthening him. One book I read this past week, I think it was by Sinclair Ferguson, talks about what that must have been like in heaven, right? God summons an angel. The angel comes before God the Father, and he says, hey, I have a visit for you, says the Father. I want you to go down to Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives, and more specifically to the Garden of Gethsemane. There you will find him. Who, Lord? Who, Lord, my servant? Who, Lord, will I find there? And God the Father answers, my servant, there you will find the suffering one. He is my son. Minister to him. Imagine what a conversation that must have been. Jesus knows our pain. He knows our suffering. Jesus knows what it's like to submit to the will of the Father. He struggled with what he must do to obey his Father's will. Now, let me say this. I believe that Jesus was always, and this is, once again, we're diving in deep here with some Trinitarian theology that it's just difficult to understand. I'll say this, never once was he ever not going to do the Father's will. He was always committed to doing the Father's will. But here we see him struggling with it. Trusting God does not mean we have to put on our happy face and pretend like things aren't going well. Being faithful does not mean that we have to deny the reality of what's going on in our hearts and our minds and souls. It doesn't mean walking through these doors every Sunday and just pretending like everything's okay. That's not the picture of faithfulness. No, it's okay to be honest. It's okay to come before the Lord and say, Lord, I know this is your will, but I don't like it. I'm struggling with facing it. I'm committed to doing your will, Father. I know your will is best, but man, this seems like more than I can bear, Father. Jesus says, as he's facing the horror of what he's going to face, he cries out. He says, all things are possible for you. He's declaring, right, the Father's omnipotence here. All things are possible, Father, but that truth can be comforting and at the same time crippling in our pain, can it? Right? You're walking through something, you're facing something, you're suffering in the midst of something, and you know God can. But then if he doesn't, right, and that can comfort you, but then if he doesn't, that can almost feel like it can cripple you. This is hard. When you cry to God about something over and over again. Jesus does this here at least 3 times. And yet the answer is no. And all I can offer you this morning is something very powerful. That God knows what it feels like. That Jesus is a man who is acquainted with our grief, with our sorrow. One of the most powerful things you can experience in life is if you're suffering with something, to have someone else come up to you and say, I've been through it. And God may not have gone through, right? You may not see Jesus dealing specifically with what you're walking through this morning. But he knows how you feel. We have a God who can relate to us. You have a God who can relate to you. Very unique with Christianity. You have a God who can relate to you in your suffering. And in fact, has suffered in a way that you will never have to suffer because he suffered. We also have a God who reveals how to be faithful in suffering. You know, as I've been looking at this passage this past week and meditating on it, one of the most shocking things that stands out to me is in verse 42. When Jesus is there and he goes back to those three disciples once again, and he tells them, get up, let's go, see my betrayer is near. And while that's shocking to me, and once again, I was trying to put this together all week. I mean, in one moment, we have Jesus on his face, sweating drops of blood, overwhelmed, physically must have an angel come down, right, in order to somehow strengthen him or speak to him. We don't know exactly what takes place there, but Jesus, it almost feels like he might die here in the garden, and then by the time we get down to verse 42, Jesus is going over the disciples, and he's boldly walking into what must happen next. Right, the very thing that he was fearing, Jesus now in verse 42 is walking boldly into that. And from here on out, we see Jesus, there's no hesitation, right? As the people come to arrest Jesus, Peter takes out a sword, and he takes out, right, and takes a swing and knocks off the high priest's servant's ear, and it gets kind of messy, and Jesus rebukes him. Jesus is so resolute in what must take place in obeying the will of the Father now that even rebukes Peter for trying to resist the very thing that he was afraid of. The thing he was seeking to avoid earlier when he prayed 3 times, Father, can you take this cup from me? Now here's the question, is Peter no longer afraid? I mean, what's going on here? Does Jesus no longer afraid? I mean, does Jesus finally say this? Does he finally say, well, I guess that's that. I might as well get on with it, and just kind of gets up and gets going? I mean, is that how Jesus handles this cup? Or does Jesus just stop being afraid? I mean, what's the secret, right? When we're overwhelmed with grief and fear and we're desperate. What is faithfulness? What empowers us to be faithful in those moments? To even be bold and resolute like it seems to be Jesus is here. And I think there's a hint in verse 36. Notice what Jesus says in verse 36 as he addresses his heavenly Father. He calls out to him, Abba, Father. Now the usual term we see in the New Testament for God being referred to as Father is pater. That's the term that Jesus uses. Every other time he says Father in the New Testament, he uses the word more like pater, but we never see him referring to Jesus as Abba here. And Abba is an Aramaic term, and it's used only once here by Jesus. There's 2 other times it appears in the New Testament. But this was not a characteristic way to address God. Your average Jew would not have addressed God by using this term because it was one that was more intimate. It was one that there was a relationship there. Beyond that was beyond just a formality of a father and a son. And I don't think that means that he's calling God or God the Father Daddy. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I might be saying too much, but there is a sense of intimate relationship here that we see here as God the Son, Jesus calls out to his Father and calls him Abba. There's a picture of trust here that's expressed in this term. And so what I think is happening here, it's not like Jesus is no longer afraid. He is afraid. I think he still is experiencing this fear. His soul is still in deep sorrow about the Father's will. But even though he is still in deep sorrow about the Father's will, I believe he has a greater confidence and assurance in the Father's heart. Jesus knew his Father intimately. Theologian Scott Swain talks about the way we view our souls and our hearts. And he says, often we're working off the wrong metaphor. Some people see their heart or their soul as a cup that has to be filled up. And a cup, right, it can be filled up with coffee or juice, or if you're gross, Diet Coke. It can be filled up, right, with all kinds of liquids. But you wouldn't put those two liquids in there at the same time. And so some people look at the heart being a cup and they would say, well, if you're going to have courage in your heart, then you must pour out your fear. And so they take exclamations like in the Bible where it says, do not be afraid. It's saying, okay, just get rid of your fear, right? You shouldn't be afraid anymore. And perhaps you've had somebody say that to you, right? Don't be afraid. You shouldn't be afraid. Get rid of your fear. That's how should you be courageous? How can you be bold? Well, it's just get rid of your fear. You have to pour out your fear, and so somebody can pour in courage, right, or faith. But he says that's not a good picture of really what the heart is, or the way that we experience emotions. He says better yet to think of the heart more like a scale. Specifically, a balance scale, like those scales you see in pictures of justice. And over here you have a balance, and over here you have another balance. And you can tell how much something weighs by putting an exact amount over here, and then you weigh it against that. And on one side of the scale, right, is our anxiety. It's our needs that are there, right? Our fears are on this one side of the scale. But on the other side, right, well, maybe I should say this, the key to dealing with our fear that's on one side of the scale is not necessarily getting rid of it, it's countering it with something else. It's putting something else heavier, more weighty on the other side of the scale. I mean, these are real fears. Jesus is not worried about something that might happen. He knows this is going to happen. So he has every reason. A natural response is to have fear. Fears can be a good thing. Anxiety can be a good thing when it's real. And this is real for Jesus. And so it's not just say he got rid of his fear. What is he doing? He's countering it with the knowledge of something that's more weighty, something that's more true. So even though Jesus' circumstances do not change, I believe what's taking place here is his fear is outweighed by his trust in the love and the goodness, the care and the purpose, and his trust in the justness of his Father. In fact, Steve didn't know he was going to do that this morning, but the passage he read in 1 Peter says just that. I've actually got that passage in my note. Let's read this passage again that we already talked about this morning. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, Peter writes these words, "For you were called to this because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. For he did not commit a sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. Which when he was insulted, he did not insult in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that after having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds, you have been healed." Go back to verse 23. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. How did Jesus, in one moment, is he on his face overwhelmed with sorrow, and in the next moment, he is resolutely walking towards his betrayer, walking towards his death, walking towards the cup he was struggling with, that he was about to face. He entrusted himself to the Father he knew. And my friends, the better you know the Father and the ways of the Father, the better you will be able to entrust yourself to him. And so how did Jesus, right? What does faithfulness look like in suffering? It means knowing the Father, having an intimate relationship with the Father, and then trusting his heart, right? It doesn't mean that you have to get rid of your fear. It means that you counter your very real fear with an even greater real truth about who God is, who the Father is. Jesus entrusted himself to this Father. And then finally, I would say this about what we see here in the garden is that we have a God who has undone our suffering. You know, when we look at the cross, I think the cross informs us, or actually when we see the garden, I think the garden informs us about how Jesus approached the cross, or how we should see the cross. On the cross, Jesus is not a helpless victim in the hands of wicked men. Now, did men crucify Jesus? Absolutely. Why? Because men were wicked and evil. But Jesus is not a helpless victim on the cross. Jesus is a surrendered son committed to doing the will of the Father on the cross. And what is he doing there in the garden and on the cross? Well, in the Bible, in Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul speaks of Jesus as a second Adam. Whereas Adam originally was the one who did not trust his father, who disobeyed God in the garden, right? It's through Adam's disobedience, right? We know that the world is fallen and broken and given over to sin and death. Now Jesus has come as the second Adam, Paul would say. And where the first Adam failed in the garden, now through Jesus' obedience in the garden, he is undoing what Adam has done. Now through the obedience of Jesus, Paul would say, the many will be made righteous and given life. Where Adam fails, Jesus succeeds. Where through Adam, life becomes death, now through Jesus, right, death is overcome with life. So on the cross, Jesus, his life is not being taken from him. He lays it down. He lays it down. And in laying down his life to the will of the Father, he takes the sin and the death for everyone who will believe, and he gives them life. He takes the suffering he endures, and in the end, he is going to restore all things to a place where there is no more suffering for those who place their trust in him. And so this morning, have you done that? God doesn't offer us a life free from suffering here. But he does offer us someone in Jesus, someone who knows our suffering, who's acquainted with our grief, who can walk with us and be present in our grief, someone who has shown us the way to move through our grief, to be faithful in the midst of it, and then through Jesus, someone who ultimately has undone our grief and can offer you a life one day A life that begins now, but one day that is fully realized, that is free from suffering and grief. And it comes through Jesus.